Accused gamblers Joseph and John Mastronardo remain in custody a week after authorities dug up the gardens at Joseph's mansion, looking for millions buried there.
Let's dig a little more in tonight's Mob Talk.
Welcome to this week's edition of Mob Talk. I'm Dave Stratweiser.
And I'm George Anastasia with the Philadelphia Inquirer.
George, this week the interesting case of Joseph and John Mastronardo, two of the biggest alleged gambler bookie folks in our region.
Yeah, and the interesting question is, who buries close to $1 million in their backyard? That's what this is about.
George, let's start with, these are no small fish here, John and Joe Mastronardo. These are big fish in a big pond.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, going back almost 30 years, Joe Vito Mastronardo has run a bookmaking operation that takes high-end gamblers. These are guys who make a lot of money and aren't afraid to gamble a lot of money.
Like to stay off the radar if they can. Big amounts of money we're talking about.
Yeah, these are legitimate business guys who don't want to deal with bookies tied to organized crime. They don't want to go down to South Philly and place a bet. They're serious gamblers, but they play at a whole nother level.
Okay, give us a whole nother level. Early in the 80s or mid-80s, we heard numbers like $50 million a year in revenue.
Yeah, that's in the 80s. Now we're 30 years later. I mean, this guy always ran a book that generated a lot of income. And it was a book based on kind of the honor system. He didn't bust kneecaps if you didn't pay. If you didn't pay, then you couldn't gamble with him anymore.
Right.
And he ran a business and established a reputation that he's the go-to guy for serious gamblers who have serious money to bet.
He says on some of the wiretaps they got in this case, I'm a professional.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing about Joe Vito Mastronardo. I mean, he's been charged with a crime again and again and again, but I think philosophically, he doesn't see this as a crime. He's a businessman providing a service, and he's got customers who are interested in buying that service, and that's what he does.
And he doesn't seem to mind giving up a couple of $1 million every few years when they come knocking on his door. He's kind of like the proverbial cash cow in waiting.
You know, that's the interesting thing. I guess in 2006, when he gave up the $2.7 million, that was kind of the cost of doing business. And if you talk to people who know his operation, they would tell you that over the years, he's made that 8, 10, 12 times over. So, yeah, it's a big number, but in the scheme of things, it's part of what his business is.
But in the 41-page affidavit of probable cause, there's lots of wiretaps in there, and he's griping in there about his very own brother John because he says he gave up too easy and gave in the money to the feds, to Montgomery County, way too easy.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting things that comes out of those snippets of wiretaps is his relationship with John. He talks about how he's always carried John. He bought him his first car, and that John's taken a ton of money from him, and John didn't want to fight that case back in 2006. He had to give up his money. He also whines and complains about the economy in general and how that's impacted his business. And then he talks about guys who don't know how to run a business, don't keep good books, don't know how to collect, those kind of things. Most of the discussions, though, are more entrepreneurial and business-like than they are wise guy talk. That's not what this is about.
Right. Now let's talk a little bit about offshore sports betting, because there seems to be at least a Costa Rica connection here that they're looking into. There's a bank in Florida, apparently they took some money out of, and a bunch of other places, and they took somewhere in the range of $2.2 million just that they found without talking about the bank accounts.
Yeah, I mean, what Mastronardo has done is tapped into that whole internet gambling scene, and the level of his play in there, what his role is not entirely clear, but I think this investigation has its roots more in an investigation into internet gambling, offshore betting, and money laundering than it does specifically the Mastronardo gambling operation.
And he uses terms right on the phone. They're up on 5 or 6 cell phones, Montgomery County, and they did a very good job at this case. Yeah. They put together a very nice package, the investigators in the case here. But he's right out there in the open talking about it. I'm glad I'm still a gambler.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about this guy is he has never made any bones about who he is and what he does. He's a professional gambler. Now, for law enforcement, it's illegal what he does. For him, it's just his way of making money, his way of living. And he's lived very, very well.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about his health. Not in very good condition earlier this week. In fact, from what we've been told, he was taken out of jail with 102 or 104 fever. He had passed out and taken to a local hospital. Can he survive weeks and weeks and weeks in jail here, which may occur because he's on a probation violation as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. He was, we know that he's been fighting cancer off and on for 4 or 5 years. He's very thin, and this kind of stuff has got to be a drain physically on him. And that, I think, what happened this week when he ran the fever, and first he was in an infirmary at the prison, and then he was taken to a hospital, is indicative of the shaky nature of his health. And there's going to be a lot of pressure over the next 4 or 5 months as this thing plays out. And one of the questions is, can he hold up and can he put up with that?
Dennis Kogan, his lawyer, says very plainly he's not involved with the mob. He doesn't use strong-arm tactics with people, things like that. But there seems to be at least some suggestion or at least some hint that you can't really operate a business like this without having some kind of interaction.
I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, traditionally, everyone has always said, this is not a wise guy, this is not a mob operation. And I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
But it's also hard to believe that he could be operating in that world with that level of money and not have reached some kind of accommodation with somebody. Now, it might not be the guys from downtown in South Philly. It might be the hierarchy in New York, perhaps. We don't know the answer to that. But that's one of the assumptions. Yeah, this is not a mob operation. He's not a mobster. But does he know mobsters? Does he have kind of a relationship with somebody? The supposition is he must have in order to, one, to last this long, and two, to play at that level.
George, given the real prospect of some jail time here, we all know Joe Mastronardo does not like to spend time in jail, and John's kind of a country club golfer, gambling aficionado, if you listen to the charges and allegations here. Neither one of these guys like to be in jail.
No, and given the crime, I mean, one, they're not a threat to the community. It wasn't a violent crime, and I don't think they're a risk of flight. So I think there could be an accommodation where if they put up enough bail money, they might be able to sit out what happens next at home under house arrest or with electronic monitor until we see where this case is going.
All right, could a deal be in the works, though, too, you think it's something?
I would think, given their track record, they've tended to make deals rather than go to trial, and if this is as serious as it looks, the smart move is to make a deal, and these guys are, at the end of the day, smart guys.
Okay, that's it for Mob Talk this week. We'll see you next week.